Big Shaq walks into a grocery store and sees something no one else dares to stop. Bullies corner a struggling single mom. But this isn't just another errand run. What Big Shaq does next flips the silence, breaks the pattern, and stuns the crowd. No fists, no shouting, just presence, power, and a truth so raw, it might make you cry. Because sometimes justice doesn't knock. It walks in quietly and stays. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning unfolded with a kind of stillness that didn't belong in suburbia. Sunlight filtered through tall oaks lining the sidewalks, casting long, clean shadows across empty lawns and quiet driveways. Wind chimes barely stirred, as if the breeze itself was holding its breath. The whole block shimmered with that artificial calm only found in neighborhoods built on silence, untroubled, unbothered, untouched. But the air carried something else that day, something beneath the light. The kind of stillness that doesn't soothe, the kind that warns. At the center of this quiet hum of civility stood Shaquille O'Neal. Not the celebrity, not the athlete, but the man. Known to some as Big Shaq, to others as just Shaq. A towering figure in stature. Yes, but it wasn't his height that turned heads today. It was the energy. Calm, watchful, the type that didn't ask for attention, but didn't let things slide either. He had parked a few rows down from the local grocery store, a place he visited when he wanted to be left alone, where he was still recognized but not approached. A place that felt normal, the kind of place where a millionaire could pick up oat milk and cornbread mix without a flashbulb or whisper following close behind. Today was supposed to be just that, a routine errand, a quiet walk through automatic doors, a few items and back to Lucille's house, but normal wasn't on the shelves that day. Inside, the store buzzed faintly with idle conversation and the soft roll of carts. A teenage employee stocked canned peaches while humming an off-key tune. A couple debated over almond or dairy milk near the refrigerator aisle. Nothing out of place, nothing loud. Then the entrance chimed again. Janelle, a young mother with weary eyes and a determined stride, stepped into the store. Her son, no older than 3, clung to her hand, his other gripping the frayed edge of a worn blue blanket. Her expression was focused, chin slightly raised, pace steady, but in her silence was a history. Every step she took held the weight of someone who had learned to stay out of the way, to make herself small even when the world made her struggle feel enormous. She moved fast, like someone on a schedule held together by faith in a fraying budget. She wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble, the quiet kind, had already noticed her. Near the cereal aisle, a man shifted his cart to block her path. His shirt was pressed, tucked tight into his belt, a Bluetooth earpiece blinking lazily at his temple. His cart barely tapped hers, but he didn't move. Instead, he stood still just long enough to force her to look up. Her response was automatic, a soft "excuse me," a practiced half-smile. But his eyes stayed cold. "Watch where you're going," he said, with the kind of rehearsed condescension that was meant to humiliate without giving anyone else reason to interfere. A second figure joined, the man's wife perhaps. She appeared to examine a box of oatmeal, but positioned herself just close enough to block the other side of the aisle. An unspoken trap had been set. The aisle narrowed not with carts, but with judgment. Janelle's posture tightened. Her eyes flicked to her son, who had grown quiet beside her. She asked again, this time gentler, almost apologetic, if they could pass. The woman responded with a slow smile.
"There's a line, sweetheart."
There was no line. A few paces away, Shaq observed the unfolding scene. His cart sat still beneath his palm, wheels locked in place. He had seen this before too many times in too many cities. It always looked different, but felt exactly the same. Subtle exclusion wrapped in polite language. Racism dressed like customer service. The air around the aisle changed. Shoppers sensed the tension but pretended not to. No one wanted to get involved. Eyes lingered, then darted away. Janelle stood in the quiet crossfire, back straight, but breath short. She didn't push, didn't yell, just waited, like someone used to being treated as an inconvenience. And still the employees didn't step in. No announcement from the intercom. No appearance from the manager. This wasn't the kind of conflict that got store policies involved. This was the kind that slipped through the cracks. Shaq began to move. Not fast, just enough to draw eyes. He didn't raise his voice, or flex his name. He didn't need to. His presence grounded, unshakable, was confrontation enough. As he approached, the man turned. Recognition flickered behind his eyes, followed closely by discomfort, and then something darker, resentment. There was no welcome in that gaze, only the unmistakable burn of an old grudge carried too long. The woman stepped aside, casually now, pretending she hadn't blocked the aisle on purpose. The man hesitated, then followed her lead. Janelle looked up, catching Shaq's eyes. No words were exchanged, just a nod. A brief grateful signal passed between two people who had survived long enough to recognize each other's battles without needing introductions. As the tension dissolved, the shoppers went back to pretending, but the weight of the moment didn't lift so easily. Janelle resumed shopping, her shoulders still tight, her son tugging at her sleeve. The boy reached for a box of cake mix, and she hesitated, checked the price, then placed it gently in the cart. A birthday, or maybe just a small joy in a long week. The simplicity of it added another weight that no one else in the store seemed to see. Shaq followed at a distance now, not intruding, just making sure. The man and woman who had started it all stood at the end of the aisle. They didn't look back, but the man whispered something, low and sour, before they turned toward checkout. Shaq's gaze stayed on them, a beat longer. Not because of what had just happened, but because there was something familiar about that man. A memory trying to surface. Not from recent headlines or old games, from much further back. Outside, the sky stayed bright. The wind still soft, but that morning calm, it had broken. The silence that began the day had shifted. Something had been exposed in the open air of that store. Not loudly, not violently, just enough to remind everyone watching, especially those who tried not to, that even in the most ordinary places, justice sometimes walks in quietly and doesn't leave until it's been seen. And Big Shaq? He was far from done. Shaquille O'Neal moved down the main aisle of the local grocery store, with the kind of quiet presence that only came with years of navigating rooms bigger than his voice. Here, among shelves of cereal and canned beans, he was met with small nods and warm glances from employees who'd grown used to his visits. He didn't speak much, didn't need to, just the subtle smile, the tilt of his head, the soft eye contact, enough to remind folks that he noticed them, and maybe even appreciated them. The cashier, a young woman with box braids and chipped blue nail polish, lit up briefly when he passed. Near the bakery, an older stock clerk in a faded vest gave him a friendly fist bump, whispering something about how his knees could still take him in a game if needed. It was banter that didn't require a response, the kind that stitched community into the quiet corners of everyday life. These people didn't know Shaq's bank balance, didn't ask for selfies, didn't bring up stats. They saw him in sweatpants and slides, carrying a shopping list and minding his own. But just as the light settled into that sense of ordinary, a subtle shift took over the store. It wasn't loud or sudden, just a gentle turning of attention. It began with one glance, then another. A pause in conversation near the frozen aisle, a whisper near the produce section, and suddenly the atmosphere thinned like air before a storm. She entered with a child at her side. Janelle moved like someone who had learned not to pause too long, in one place. Not because she was in a rush, but because slowing down invited judgment. Her eyes scanned the shelves with the efficiency of someone used to stretching every dollar. Her free hand kept her coat closed against her side, though the weather didn't call for it. Her son, a small boy with wide brown eyes and a head full of soft curls, held her leg and looked up at everything with that delicate mix of curiosity and wariness. The moment she stepped inside, the store changed. The warmth dulled, like someone had dimmed the emotional lights. An older woman near the entrance glanced at Janelle and nudged her husband. A teenage boy by the magazine rack smirked as he leaned into his friend's shoulder. Nothing was said, at least, not out loud. Shaq had seen this before, the way eyes follow without blinking. The way space around someone seems to close without reason. It wasn't new. It wasn't rare. But it always carried the same sting. Janelle didn't flinch. She moved toward the back, where the discounted items were kept. Her son tugged at her coat when they passed the cereal aisle. She paused, let him pick up a box with cartoon tigers on it, then placed it gently back when she noticed the price. Her voice was calm when she told him, maybe next time. He didn't cry. He just nodded and clung tighter to her side. Shaq had stepped into the neighboring aisle, but kept her in sight. Something about the rhythm of her steps said, this wasn't the first time she'd been watched like this. There was an invisible weight she carried, years of learned restraint, forced politeness, and quiet endurance, the kind that didn't come from training but survival. Near the dairy section, the murmurs grew. A pair of middle-aged customers stood by the yogurt, talking softly behind cupped hands. The man's jaw tightened as he looked at Janelle, then quickly turned away when she met his eye. His wife, arms folded tight across her chest, scoffed just loud enough for it to travel. No one offered help. No one intervened. Just judgment in glances, and ice in the tone of passers-by. Then came the false kindness. A man in a vest with the store logo approached Janelle near the eggs, clipboard in hand, posture too upright to be casual. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" His voice carried just enough authority to suggest a question disguised as a warning. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. She blinked, nodded. "Yes, I'm just shopping." He lingered for a beat too long before turning away, tapping his pen against the clipboard like a threat he never had to say aloud. She stared after him, lips pressed together, then looked down at her son. The boy reached up to touch her arm. "Are we in trouble?" he asked, so quietly it barely made it past the lettuce. "No," she whispered. "We're just getting dinner." Shaq remained still in the adjacent aisle, heart tightening. He knew that tone, the one a mother uses when she wants to believe the lie she's telling, just as much as her child needs to. He also knew what was coming next. The pattern never broke, not in places like this. As she reached for a carton of eggs, another customer's cart rolled by too close. It nudged hers, not enough to be a crash, but more than a coincidence. The man behind it offered a quick oops, laced with sarcasm, then added, "Some folks just get in the way, don't they?" It wasn't the words. It was the tone. The implication. The certainty that he'd be backed by silence. He looked at Janelle like she was an interruption to his day. She said nothing, just adjusted her cart and kept moving. But the boy looked up at the man. "My mommy didn't do nothing," he said with a shaky voice. The man didn't respond, just gave a dry chuckle, and moved on. Another passerby raised a brow, smirking before turning back to her shelf. Shaq finally moved again, pushing his cart slowly into the main walkway between frozen foods and dry goods. Not directly toward Janelle, not toward the man, just forward. Presence, when applied with enough force, can bend atmosphere. A few shoppers took notice. The same ones who had stayed silent now exchanged glances again. But this time not at Janelle, at Shaq. He passed the scene with eyes calm but unblinking. It wasn't a confrontation, not yet, but it was a statement. A shift in gravity. The man with the sarcastic tone recognized him. His smirk faltered. The couple near the yogurt straightened up. The clipboard employee pretended to be engrossed in inventory. The silence thickened, but this time it wasn't hostile. It was uneasy. A power had entered the room that didn't match their script. Janelle noticed too. Her gaze followed Shaq's path briefly, confusion flickering into gratitude before she returned to her list. She continued toward the checkout line, placing each item with care. Eggs, bread, a single box of cake mix, cans of soup, everything chosen for utility, nothing for pleasure. Shaq stood 2 lanes over, his cart only half filled. From his spot he watched the cashier ring up her items. The clerk avoided eye contact with Janelle, speaking only in clipped phrases. But when Shaq stepped forward to pay for his things, the same clerk smiled wide and asked how his mother was doing. He answered calmly. Kept it light. But in his eyes was the fire of a man who never forgot what it looked like when dignity was denied in daylight. Outside, the sun hadn't changed. The sky was still a crisp, cloudless blue, but the weight of the grocery store lingered like residue. As Janelle stepped toward the exit with her son's hand in hers, someone near the customer service desk called out just loud enough. "Some people always make a scene." The words weren't aimed directly, but they struck, and she knew it, and so did the boy. Shaq followed them out a minute later, slowly, silently, not to impose, just to be present, because in a world full of watchers, sometimes the only shield a person has is another witness, one who refuses to look away. Near the front of aisle 7, the sound of plastic wheels stuttered against polished tile. Janelle, holding her son's hand and keeping her head slightly bowed, maneuvered her cart toward the condiments section. Her pace had quickened, not enough to draw attention, but just enough to show she was trying to finish her shopping with minimal interference. The items in her cart were modest. Bread, eggs, a small container of juice, a single pack of ground turkey, each placed deliberately, as if even groceries required strategy. Behind her, judgment trailed in soft footsteps. It happened near the corner where two aisles met, a spot that usually held paper towels stacked in an end cap display. As Janelle rounded it, her cart brushed up lightly against another. Nothing alarming, just the typical jostle of grocery traffic. But the man she bumped into froze, his fingers tightening around his cart's handle like it had been shoved. The man was in his late 40s, dressed cleanly but with a stiffness that suggested control was more important to him than comfort. His eyes narrowed as he turned to face her. No irritation at first, just calculation, as if deciding how much of a scene to allow himself. Janelle immediately backed her cart an inch. "Sorry about that," she said quietly, her voice smooth but tired. He didn't move. She smiled slightly, a practiced gesture that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Didn't see you there." Still, he stayed put. The pause stretched long enough for tension to settle into the corners of the aisle. The air changed, not loud or sudden, but unmistakably, like the moment just before a glass tips off a ledge. The man finally spoke. "You people always say that." The words were wrapped in a casual tone, but the phrase cut sharp and deliberate. There was no ambiguity in the target, and in that instant, something fragile around Janelle's expression cracked, not visibly but in the tightness of her shoulders, the flicker in her gaze. Her son, sensing the shift, looked up from the toy section across the way and clung to her side without a word. Two more carts rolled in from behind. One was pushed by a woman in a pastel sweater vest, mid-60s, with the kind of polite smile that didn't change even when her words turned cruel. She stood beside the man, glancing at Janelle with practiced judgment. Behind her, another man, balding, with a veteran's cap tilted back on his head, joined the wall forming around Janelle's cart. "Maybe next time. Pay attention," the older woman said, placing a bottle of mustard in her cart, as if that neutral action somehow balanced the acidity in her tone. The third man chuckled. "It's always the same, isn't it? Someone else's fault." Janelle said nothing. Her hands gripped the handle of her cart just a little tighter, her fingers whitening at the knuckles. She looked down at her son, who watched the exchange with a stillness far too mature for his age. Across the aisle, and behind the corner of a towering display of crackers, Shaq stood still. He hadn't moved since the first bump. His cart remained beside him, untouched. The crease between his brows deepened, but his face gave away nothing else. He'd seen this pattern unfold before. The escalation never screamed. It smiled. It moved slow. It waited for witnesses to look away. His eyes swept the surrounding area. A store associate had glanced toward the scene, caught a glimpse of the group forming, then quickly returned to rearranging cans on a lower shelf. A young couple near the dairy section watched for a moment, then whispered something to each other before pretending to compare brands of orange juice. A manager was visible near the entrance to the stockroom, but his attention stayed on a clipboard. No one stepped in. "Not yet." Janelle cleared her throat. "If you'll let me through, please," she said, her voice steady but low. The man she bumped shook his head slightly, as if baffled by her audacity. "You already made enough of a mess, don't you think?" The woman added, "You think just saying sorry erases everything?" The absurdity in their words wasn't meant to be logical. It was meant to box her in, shame her, isolate her, a form of control disguised as civility. No shouting, no swearing, just layers of layered disrespect, reinforced by a circle of complicit smiles. Her son finally whispered something, just a few words, barely audible, but it was enough to soften her posture. Enough to remind her she wasn't just standing up for herself. Shaq took one step forward. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to break the static. The man turned slightly in his direction but said nothing. The others shifted too, their eyes recognizing him now. Not just the towering figure, but the name, the presence, and yet there was no apology. Only recalibration, the kind of unease that doesn't come from guilt, but from being seen. Janelle tried to edge her cart forward again. The man made a show of stepping aside, but the motion was slow and theatrical, dragging his feet with exaggerated caution. "You're welcome," he said with a sneer, as if he'd performed an act of generosity. The older woman nodded at Janelle as she passed. "Some people just need to learn manners." Janelle didn't respond. She moved forward, guiding her son carefully, keeping her back straight even as her heart pounded in her ears. Shaq waited a few seconds, then turned the corner and followed behind them. His cart moved slowly, deliberately. As he passed the group, he looked each one of them in the eye. No words, just steady, unwavering gaze. The effect was immediate. The man glanced down at his shoes. The woman pretended to be invested in a price tag. The third member of their impromptu assembly stared ahead as if Shaq didn't exist. Tension pulsed through the air like static trapped between ceiling tiles and fluorescent lights. It was everywhere in the pacing of the steps, the stiffened backs of nearby shoppers, the sudden silence of the aisle now half abandoned. Further down, Janelle reached the baby products aisle and leaned briefly against the cart. Her son tugged on her sleeve, and she bent down to wipe something from his cheek. The moment was small, but it held gravity. Not because of what had just happened, but because she knew it wasn't over. Shaq kept his distance, close enough to observe, far enough to allow space. He wasn't just watching the people who had confronted her. He was watching the ones who hadn't. The ones who had seen and said nothing. The ones whose silence formed the foundation that incidents like these stood upon. He turned back briefly to catch a final glimpse of the trio. They were still standing near the condiments, whispering now, glancing around, uneasy. Their confidence had thinned. They were no longer in control. They had been seen. Injustice had a pattern. Shaq understood it better than most. It didn't come in shouting matches or thrown fists. It came in barriers made of stares, traps formed with smirks, 1,000 tiny jabs disguised as politeness. But something had shifted now. Not enough to break the system. Just enough to fracture the moment. And sometimes, that's where real change begins. The air inside the store had begun to shift again. Not because the crowd had grown louder or more obvious, but because the tension was tightening like a string pulled too far. It vibrated just beneath the surface, through the silence of bystanders, the strained composure of a woman trying not to react, and the steady breath of a man who had seen enough to know timing changes everything. Big Shaq stood still, his cart beside him, untouched since the aisle confrontation. His eyes remained on Janelle, who now stood near the refrigerated section, holding a container of milk in one hand, her son leaning into her side. Her shoulders trembled just slightly, the kind of tremble that didn't belong to fear, but to endurance. She hadn't cried, she hadn't shouted, but she was close to something breaking, and Shaq knew that feeling, knew it better than most. He'd felt it once as a teenager, in Newark, when he and his mother had walked into a department store, looking for dress shoes before Sunday service. He remembered the way the clerk's eyes darted past them like they didn't matter. How the only words they spoke were "those are too expensive for you." He remembered Lucille's grip on his wrist, her thumb circling his skin like she was drawing patience into him. And again in college, early success, early fame. He'd walked into a restaurant with teammates. They were all served, but his plate arrived last, cold. A coincidence, they said. But he'd seen the glance exchanged by the staff. He didn't speak that day. Didn't flip the table, just memorized the moment. Even after becoming Big Shaq, even after the wealth, the rings, the interviews, the partnerships, the press, there were rooms that tightened when he entered. Smiles that dropped when he stood too close. Voices that trembled when he asked a simple question. He learned to read people not by their words, but by the space they gave or didn't. But it was his mother, always, who taught him not to answer fire with fire. Lucille O'Neill had walked through storms and raised a man who knew how to hold his ground without turning to flame. Let them show who they are first, she had told him once. Let them open their mouths and bare their teeth. That's when you speak. That's when you move. Not before. Patience wasn't silence. It was strategy. And over time, Shaq had learned how to wield it, like armor. Now watching Janelle's hands tremble just slightly, as she adjusted the milk in her cart, he could feel the edge of the moment pressing against him. She was breaking, but still holding. Her son clung to the side of the cart now, eyes wide, voice quiet. His hand reached up and held onto her jacket sleeve, as if sensing that the floor beneath them wasn't as stable as it seemed. No one approached. No one offered help. Around her, the silence from other shoppers had curdled into complicity. The same people who had smiled at Shaq minutes ago now looked anywhere but at the woman on the verge of tears. A manager passed by with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He caught a glimpse of her but kept walking, redirecting his gaze to the inventory sheet. Janelle knelt to adjust her son's coat, and in that small motion, Shaq saw something final in her posture. The way her knees bent, not out of necessity, but out of surrender. Her hand moved to the boy's cheek, brushed something away, but lingered there a moment, too long. That touch wasn't just reassurance, it was apology. For what? She didn't know yet. but something in her expected another humiliation. Shaq moved then. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. There was no raised voice, no confrontation, just a shift, a deliberate quiet step into her orbit. His presence filled the space behind her like gravity. His shadow stretched farther than the light around her, not because of his size, but because of the calm force he carried. Janelle turned slightly, startled. Her eyes met his. She hadn't expected anyone to come near, much less someone who carried the weight of public recognition. But the look Shaq gave wasn't performance. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. And something steadier, like the ground beneath her had been reinforced. He nodded once. She didn't speak, but the way her shoulders released, the way her jaw unclenched, said everything. The man from earlier, still near the condiment section, noticed the shift. His eyes met Shaq's for a moment, then quickly dropped. The others who had lingered around the earlier confrontation now seemed to fade into their own reflections. One pushed their cart in the opposite direction. Another took out their phone but thought better of it. Shaq didn't speak to the crowd. He didn't need to. His silence held the authority of someone who had spent years holding his voice until the moment mattered. And this moment did. A store clerk, one of the younger employees who'd greeted him earlier, approached hesitantly. She wasn't part of the earlier incidents. Her eyes showed concern, not fear. "Everything okay, Mr. O'Neill?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Shaq looked at her, then at Janelle, then back. He answered with a slight nod, but his expression didn't soften. It was a warning, not to her, but to the system she worked in. A reminder that even quiet cruelty has witnesses now. The employee nodded quickly and stepped back. Janelle stood, adjusted her coat, and whispered something to her son. The boy looked up at Shaq. Not in awe, not like he was meeting a celebrity, but like he was seeing something unfamiliar, safety in the form of a stranger. Shaq motioned gently toward the cart. Without asking, without explaining, he moved beside her and pushed it forward, walking beside her like it had been the plan all along. Janelle blinked, unsure whether to protest, but her body said yes before her mind could say no. They moved through the rest of the store that way, side by side, unhurried. No one else stepped in their path. The eyes that once lingered, now looked away, and while no one said a word, the shift was undeniable. At checkout, the cashier tried to be warm, but her smile shook at the edges. Shaq stood back, letting Janelle place her items on the conveyor belt. Her hands were steadier now. She spoke softly to her son, pointing at the cake mix and reminding him they'd make it that evening. She reached for her wallet. Shaq placed a card on the counter before she could hand over any cash. The cashier hesitated. "Sir, run it," he said calmly. The tone wasn't aggressive, just absolute. Janelle looked at him, startled again, her lips parting like she might protest. But this time he shook his head once. Gentle, firm. She nodded back. No fuss. No thanks. Just understanding. Outside, the wind had picked up. The leaves stirred restlessly on the sidewalk, fluttering like whispers escaping from behind locked mouths. As Janelle stepped out into the sunlight, she paused. Shaq walked a few steps ahead, then turned. She gave him one look, not the look of someone rescued, but the look of someone seen. And that was enough. Because the real power in waiting isn't in silence. It's in knowing when to stop being silent. And Big Shaq had waited long enough. Big Shaq's presence had shifted the energy of the store, not with force or spectacle, but with stillness. The same man who'd shattered backboards now stood in a grocery aisle, carrying nothing but a cart and conviction. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't confronted anyone directly. And still, the building felt changed. People knew something had happened, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. They reached the front again. Janelle's son was humming softly now, running his fingers along the edge of the cereal box he finally got to keep. His voice was light, unaware of the weight that had hovered just above them minutes earlier. His innocence refused to be dimmed. Janelle moved more steadily now, though fatigue still clung to her. She glanced at Shaq with something between gratitude and disbelief. Still no words. Still no need. But the store wasn't done yet. Just as they turned toward the express checkout, a voice rose from near the customer service counter. Not loud, but sharp enough to carry. "Well, that's the thing now, isn't it? Play the victim and let someone else pay your bill." Shaq didn't flinch. He stopped, eyes tracking the voice like sonar. Janelle froze beside him. Her son clutched her sleeve. Around them, the world slowed. The speaker stepped into view. It was the same man from earlier, the one whose cart had collided with hers. His name hadn't been spoken yet. His tone had done the talking all along. He stood straighter now, emboldened by the watching crowd and the illusion that he was somehow righting a wrong. Behind him, the same two companions from earlier hovered at a distance, not as confident, but unwilling to leave his side. Shaq turned slowly, not with anger, with purpose. Every movement was deliberate, like each second was a page turning. The man took another step forward, gesturing with an open palm. I mean, let's not pretend like this is charity. You didn't just decide to help her. You're trying to make a point, aren't you? Shaq didn't answer immediately. He studied the man for a beat, then another. Then, without raising his voice, without stepping closer, he spoke. It's not about charity. It's about decency. The man scoffed. Decency's not something you buy in a grocery store. Shaq nodded slowly. You're right. You can't buy it. You carry it. Or you The words weren't delivered like insults. They were reflections. And they landed not with volume, but with weight. The man's expression tightened. He tried to laugh, but it came out crooked. You think because you're some big-time athlete you get to walk in here and preach? A pause, and then the shift. You don't remember me, do you? The man added, stepping forward just enough to close the space between performance and revelation. Back in Newark, Summer League, 88. I was the one starting center before you transferred in. Shaq's gaze sharpened. The name hadn't come yet, but the memory clicked. His eyes stayed locked on the man, and for the first time the calm threatened to crack. Dennis Calloway. The name landed like a forgotten file resurfacing from the depths. Dennis smiled, but it was hollow. Didn't take long for you to bump the rest of us to the bench. Shaq took one slow step forward. That was 30 years ago, and some of us still remember what it felt like to be erased, Dennis said, bitterness leaking into every syllable. You were always the quiet type, too good to talk trash, too tall to be challenged, the golden boy. The audience was forming again. Small groups near the entrance, lingering shoppers pretending to browse. The scene had returned, but this time it wasn't about Janelle. This time the undercurrent was deeper, personal, historical, twisted. Shaq didn't react the way Dennis expected. There was no embarrassment, no denial, only the truth, told plainly. I wasn't trying to erase anyone. I was trying to play, trying to make something out of what we were given. Dennis laughed coldly. And now what? You think buying some groceries makes you a saint? Shaq's eyes drifted briefly to Janelle, then to her son, then back to Dennis. It's not about being a saint. It's about being present when others disappear. His voice wasn't louder now, but the silence it created was thunderous. You think people don't see what you said to her, what you tried to do? That was never about a cart. That was about making someone feel small, so you could feel taller. Dennis opened his mouth to respond, but Shaq raised a hand, not commanding, just enough to pause him. You called her ma'am back there, but not out of respect. The way you said it, the way you stretched it like poison, like it was something she should feel ashamed to be. Murmurs rippled through the nearby shoppers. The weight of the words had started to land. There's a way to say ma'am that honors someone, that sees her, that respects her struggle, her dignity, her presence. Shaq continued. And there's a way to say it, that cuts, that judges, that reminds her of the line you think she crossed just by being here. Dennis shifted, visibly uncomfortable now. The heat had turned, not from Shaq's tone, but from the truth being spoken out loud in a place that rarely hosted it.
I didn't mean it like that, Dennis muttered.
Shaq tilted his head slightly. But you did, and you thought no one would call it what it was. Silence again. The store felt like it had stopped breathing. Shaq turned to the gathered faces, not with accusation, but with invitation. This isn't about shaming someone. It's about recognizing what we let pass in daylight. The words we use, the looks we give, the assumptions we carry. It adds up. He glanced back at Janelle, whose hand now rested on her son's shoulder. Her eyes shimmered, not from fear, but from something else. Validation, Shaq continued. Some of us grew up being told to keep our heads down, to wait for someone else to speak up, to hope someone else would notice. But hoping doesn't change anything. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't applaud, but they listened. And in that stillness, something shifted. A reckoning. Dennis stepped back. His voice had vanished. His companions peeled off quietly. The crowd parted, not to shame them, but to let them go. They were no longer the center. Shaq turned back to Janelle. No words passed between them. Just a breath shared in silence. Then he looked down at the boy, who watched everything with wide, knowing eyes. "What's your name?" Shaq asked gently. The boy hesitated. "Carter." Shaq nodded. "That's a strong name." The boy smiled. And with that the moment ended. Not with a bang, not with a speech, but with a truth too big for anyone to deny. Shaq turned, pushing the cart forward again. Janelle followed beside him, her son skipping lightly between their footsteps. And behind them, the store didn't return to normal. It had been changed, not by anger, but by the way one man chose to say the word ma'am, and the way another man chose to answer it. It was then that Janelle stepped into view again. She hadn't meant to interrupt, but her son had pulled her gently toward the sound. She looked at Shaq, then at Dennis, sensing the weight of history she wasn't part of, but that had clearly shaped the moment. Dennis noticed her too. His eyes lingered on the boy, on the groceries in their cart, on the quiet strength Janelle carried now. Something faltered in his posture. Shame, maybe, or just the realization that the moment had passed him by. Shaq watched it all. He didn't push the confrontation further. He had said what needed saying. The rest belonged to Dennis now. "You can keep carrying this, Dennis," Shaq said as he turned away, "or you can finally set it down." Dennis didn't answer. Janelle and her son moved toward the register again. Shaq followed, his steps slow, grounded. The aisle behind them remained frozen for a moment, like a paused film frame. Then, slowly, it resumed. But nothing was the same, because the crowd had heard it. The truth, the bitterness, the wound that hadn't healed. And they'd seen the difference between someone who carried pain and someone who passed it on. Outside, sunlight hit the parking lot in gold streaks. The day was still bright, the sky still open. But inside the store, something invisible had been settled. Not with fists, not with shouting, but with a name that was never forgotten, and a history finally spoken. Near the front of the store, the rhythm of scanning and bagging had resumed, but it felt hollow, like a machine still running in the aftermath of a power surge. The confrontation between Shaq and Dennis had melted away into a strange quiet. The kind that doesn't bring peace, only pause. The shift in air hadn't gone unnoticed. Eyes still peeked from behind shelves, heads turned cautiously, but no one dared to speak aloud the weight they'd just witnessed. Not far from the register, the store manager stood stiffly near a display of seasonal candies, clipboard in hand, gaze locked in the vague direction of the incident. He had watched it all unfold. Janelle's cart being blocked, the layered humiliation, Dennis's snide remarks, the slow collapse of decency in his own store. But he hadn't moved. Not once. His name tag read, Howard, polished, pristine, perched above the embroidered logo of the store. His khakis were pressed, his shirt tucked. He looked like someone who had been trained to keep things neat, even when the truth got messy. And that's what this was now. Messy. He saw the customers, saw how they were watching him now. Not Shaq, not Dennis. Him, wondering what he would do. If he'd say something, step in, call for security, offer even the bare minimum of authority. But Howard didn't move. Because Dennis was a regular, the kind of regular who donated to local fundraisers and hosted block parties in the better part of town. The kind who knew the district manager on a first-name basis. The kind who came in twice a week and always brought business. Shaq? Sure, he was a name, a big one. But fame, Howard had learned, was slippery. It brought headlines, not guarantees. People admired celebrities from afar, but rarely stood beside them when conflict threatened comfort. And comfort was the product Howard protected most in this store. Shaq glanced once toward the manager, the look direct, firm. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a question. Will you stand for anything today? Howard blinked. He turned away, eyes back to his clipboard, pretending to study inventory numbers that didn't matter. Shaq didn't need the answer. He'd already seen it. Janelle remained near the checkout, placing her last few items on the conveyor belt. Her son Carter stood beside her, looking up at the overhead signs like they meant something more than aisle numbers. He hadn't spoken since the confrontation, not even to her. He clutched the same cereal box from earlier, hugging it now like a small shield. The cashier rang up the items with robotic rhythm, her smile replaced by a careful neutrality. She didn't speak either, and that was the new language of the store now. Silence. Not from peace, from paralysis. The register beeped once more, and then the belt stopped. The total flashed on the screen. Shaq, standing just behind Janelle, handed over his card before she could even reach for her purse. She turned slightly, about to object, but he gently shook his head. Again, no words, no scene, just presence. And then Carter spoke. Just one sentence. Small, honest, heartbreaking. Why didn't anyone help my mom? His voice wasn't angry, wasn't loud. It was soft, clear, pure in a way that sliced deeper than any insult could. The kind of voice that held up a mirror to every adult in that room. Time didn't freeze. It fractured. The customers who had watched it all from a distance looked down at their shoes. One man near the greeting cards shifted uncomfortably, as if searching for a way out of a room with no doors. A woman by the deli wiped her hands on her purse strap, her expression crumpling into something between guilt and shame. Even Howard, from across the room, paused. The sentence echoed in the space between shelves and soda coolers, not because of how it was said, but because it hadn't been said by someone with power. It had come from a child, and children, unfiltered, often ask the questions adults spend years learning how to ignore. Shaq watched the effect ripple through the store. The real confrontation hadn't been the shouting or the subtle racism, or the past with Dennis. It was this single unarmed question from a little boy who saw more clearly than most. No one could answer it. Not because there wasn't an answer, but because the real one hurt too much to say out loud. Shaq leaned down slightly, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. Sometimes, he said softly, people get scared of doing the right thing, but that doesn't make it right. You were brave today, and your mom? She's the strongest person here. Carter didn't speak again, but he nodded, his small face tightening into something that wasn't sadness, not quite, but something older than any child should have to feel. Janelle swallowed hard. Her hand rested over her son's. Her eyes didn't cry, but they trembled. The items were bagged, paid for. Shaq lifted them carefully into the cart. No applause followed. No manager stepped forward to apologize. The store returned to motion, but not to normal. Something unspoken had shifted in its foundation. As Shaq walked Janelle and Carter to the exit, eyes followed. Not with disdain this time, but with the weight of that single question hanging in the air like fog. Outside, the parking lot glowed under a soft sun. Birds moved lazily overhead. The world looked unchanged. But inside the store, that question still echoed. Why didn't anyone help? And no one had the courage to answer. Shaq guided the cart toward Janelle's car, a dented maroon sedan parked a few spots from the entrance. The windows were cracked just enough to keep it from baking. She didn't say much as they walked. She moved with the quiet exhaustion of someone who'd learned to conserve her words, because her world rarely listened. Carter skipped ahead, momentarily distracted by a beetle crawling near the wheel of a shopping cart return. Shaq lifted the grocery bags into the back seat without being asked. His hands moved with care, making sure the eggs weren't crushed and the bread wasn't flattened beneath the milk. Janelle opened the passenger door and helped Carter into his booster seat, tightening the strap with the same automatic grace she applied to everything else. Then she paused. Her hand lingered on the door. She glanced up, eyes meeting Shaq's. Something passed between them. Not gratitude, not awkwardness. Permission, maybe. You got a minute? She asked, motioning to the edge of the curb where a shaded stretch of concrete sat under a spindly tree. He nodded, no hesitation, and followed. They sat side by side, no rush, no crowd, just two strangers, on the edge of a grocery store lot. The hum of distant traffic and the occasional chirp of a bird, the only sounds between them. Janelle stared straight ahead, her hands in her lap, thumbs tracing the lines of her fingers, like she was searching for the right words in the grooves of her own skin. I don't usually let people help me, she began, not looking at him. Not because I'm proud, just because it makes things harder. Shaq didn't interrupt. She breathed in slow. It's just me and Carter now. My mom's been sick for a while, lungs mostly. She used to watch him after school, but lately she can't even get out of bed. So now I work nights at the front desk of a motel off I-75, and I do daycare shifts in the afternoon when I can get them. Most days I sleep in the car between shifts so Carter doesn't hear me break down in the house. Her voice didn't crack when she said it. It wasn't the confession of someone seeking pity. It was the math of her life. Numbers, hours, fatigue, all calculated into a survival equation that never quite balanced. Shaq kept his gaze forward, letting her speak without pressure. Sometimes the absence of a question is the best invitation. I didn't come to that store to make a scene, she continued. I came for 1 box of cake mix. That's it. Today's his birthday. I didn't have enough for balloons or presents or a party, but I was gonna let him pick whatever cake he wanted. I had just enough left after rent. Shaq's fingers folded slowly around his knees. A quiet breath left him. He still said nothing. Janelle's voice softened. I knew the way they looked at me. I've seen it before. You get used to that tone. The little smirks. The stares that slide right past you like your background noise. But today felt heavier. I don't know why. She turned now, finally meeting Shaq's eyes. And then you showed up. There was a beat of stillness. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that aches. Then she looked back down at her hands. I haven't told anyone this, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Not even my mom. Not because it's a secret. I just didn't think it mattered. Shaq glanced at her, a flicker of curiosity behind the calm. She inhaled deeply, gathering something bigger than air. 3 years ago, I was walking home from the bus stop after my late shift. It was almost midnight. I took a shortcut through the park behind the elementary school. Something I'd done 100 times. But that night, I heard something. A struggle. A man yelling. A girl crying. Her fingers curled around her palms now. I froze for a second. Thought maybe I was imagining it. But then I saw them. A teenage girl, maybe 16, pinned against the fence by some guy in a hoodie. He was yelling at her, grabbing her arms. She kept saying no, over and over. She shook her head, as if the memory still hadn't let go. I didn't have a phone. My bag had been stolen the week before. I could have run for help. I should have, but I didn't. I picked up a rock and screamed like a madwoman. Ran straight at him. Her voice didn't rise. It stayed even. But something deeper sat underneath. A tremor too steady to be called fear. He ran. Just like that. Took off. The girl was shaking, crying. But she was safe. I stayed with her until she could call her mom. She begged me not to call the police. Said she'd get in trouble for being out late. I never got her name. Shaq looked at her now, fully. His expression wasn't surprise. It was respect. I walked home that night, thinking maybe what I did didn't matter. No one saw it. No one knew. But every time someone looks at me like I'm nothing, I remember that girl. And I remind myself that I'm not. A long silence followed. Shaq finally spoke. Voice low. You saved someone. Janelle gave a small shrug. I helped. That's all. He nodded slowly. Sometimes that's everything. They sat there for another few minutes. No more stories. No need. The weight of her words filled the space more than any conversation could. Then, quietly, Janelle stood. A thank you. Not just for the groceries. For seeing me. That doesn't happen much. Shaq stood too. He's lucky to have you, he said, motioning toward the car where Carter now dozed off in his seat. Janelle smiled again. This time there was less ache. They parted without another word. Shaq watched as she climbed into her car, started the engine, and pulled slowly out of the lot. The taillights blinked, then disappeared into the sunlit afternoon. He stood there a moment longer, staring out across the street like he was watching more than just traffic. Like he was watching a truth unfold. Because sometimes, the stories that never get told are the ones that hold the most power. And the people who carry them, they're not invisible. They're just waiting for someone to notice. Shaq walked toward his black SUV at the far end of the parking lot, the same one he'd parked earlier that afternoon, under a modest row of trees, away from the crowd. The paint shimmered under sunlight, or at least it should have. He slowed his steps. The shine was gone. As he approached, the damage became clear. Long, deep scratches etched violently across the passenger door, slashing through the finish like claws. But it wasn't just mindless keying. The lines curved into shapes, shapes into letters, and letters into something far more deliberate. 2 words. Sharp, ugly, racial. He didn't need to read them twice. He stood still. The breeze blew harder now, colder, as if nature itself had recoiled from what had been done. Behind him, the store still buzzed in ignorance. Customers trickled in and out. Bags swayed from arms. The world continued. But time around him froze. Shaq didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He didn't even glance around to see if anyone was watching. He just stood there, his massive frame unmoving, his expression unreadable. Yet inside him, Something was stirring, quiet and concentrated. A storm without thunder. The sound of soft footsteps approached. It was a young employee, barely out of high school, wearing a bright red vest and earbuds that hung loose around his neck. He paused a few feet away, then stepped forward slowly. "Mr. O'Neill, I think you should come inside. Talk to the manager. Maybe they can check the footage or something." Shaq nodded once. No words. He turned and began walking. Inside the store, the energy hadn't changed much. Families in the checkout lanes, kids crying over candy, workers restocking shelves. It all looked normal, undisturbed. The calm after chaos, but not for long. Shaq didn't stop at the customer service desk. He walked straight through the main aisle, until he spotted Howard, the same manager who'd stood silently during everything earlier. Clipboard in hand again, posture rigid, eyes trying not to meet anyone else's. Shaq stopped a few feet in front of him. Just close enough. Howard looked up. The color drained from his face. "There's been damage to my vehicle," Shaq said, voice calm. "I need to see the footage." Howard opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a weak smile. "Right. Of course. Let me check with security." Minutes passed. Shaq waited at the end of the customer service counter, hands folded in front of him. No pacing, no tapping, just stillness. But it pulled attention. Shoppers began to recognize him again. Whispers floated. Phones hovered. The man who'd spoken earlier, the one with the smirk and the clipboard, was gone, and yet his fingerprints had never left. Howard returned, adjusting his belt nervously. "Yeah, I'm afraid the cameras in that section of the lot were undergoing maintenance today. We didn't get any footage." There it was. Shaq's jaw tensed, but his voice didn't rise. So nothing was recorded. Howard shifted. "No, sir. Unfortunately." Shaq stared at him a moment longer. Then he turned, not toward the exit, but toward the center of the store, toward the main floor where dozens of customers roamed, where it had all started. He walked there slowly, purposefully, and stopped near the produce section. A small girl in a stroller pointed at him, whispering to her mother. The mother gave a nervous smile. Shaq turned to face the space, and then, without raising his voice, he began to speak. "Some of you saw what happened earlier." A hush began to fall over the shoppers. One by one, heads turned. A cashier stopped scanning. A manager peeked from behind the meat counter. A teenager with earbuds paused mid-bite into a granola bar. "Some of you didn't," Shaq continued. "And that's fine. But now something else happened. My car was vandalized outside this store. Slurs, hate." He didn't show pictures, didn't demand sympathy. "I've been called names before. I've been followed in stores. I've been asked if I was lost in places I could afford to buy. But this was something else. This wasn't whispered. It wasn't accidental. It was meant to remind me that no matter how big you get, some people will still try to cut you down." No one interrupted. No one dared. "I'm not here to ask for justice," he said, "because justice shouldn't need to be asked for. I'm here to ask a different question." He looked around the room, at the mothers holding carts, at the fathers pretending to read labels, at the teenagers filming from behind displays, at Howard standing frozen near the floral section. "How many of you saw what happened to that woman earlier today?" A few heads dropped. A man near the milk aisle rubbed the back of his neck. A woman in a blue blouse stepped back from her cart. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't being loud. She was just existing. And some people decided that was too much. So they boxed her in, laughed at her, belittled her, all while her son watched. His voice stayed even, no dramatic crescendo, but it pulsed with weight, and no one stopped them. Not because they agreed, but because it was easier to stay quiet. Someone in the back cleared their throat. Another shifted uncomfortably. Shaq took one step forward. "I grew up big. People always told me to use my size, to dominate, to overpower. But my mother told me something else. She said power without purpose is just noise. And I've spent my life trying not to be noise." A teenage boy dropped his phone slowly, forgetting he'd been filming. "I'm not mad about my car. That's just paint. I'm mad about what it represents, about the idea that even now, in broad daylight, in public, people still feel entitled to hate and confident enough to leave their mark." He paused, looked at the crowd. "But what hurts worse than the words on my car is the silence that followed." The room was still. Even the registers stopped beeping. Shaq nodded once. then turned to walk away. Just before he reached the door, a woman's voice called out. "I saw it." He turned slightly. "I saw the man who did it," she said, trembling. "I was scared to say something, but I saw him." Shaq didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Then say it." And she did. The silence finally broke. A ripple moved through the crowd. A reckoning. Not loud, but undeniable. Shaq pushed open the door and stepped into the fading sun. He wasn't walking away from the damage. He was walking toward something bigger than justice. He was walking toward truth. Applause still echoed behind him, but it was already beginning to lose steam. That's what happened when people clapped to feel better, not to do better. It fizzled, it faded, and it never stuck. Shaq leaned against the door and exhaled slowly, like he was letting go of a weight that had been sitting too long on his chest. The vandalism on the passenger side was still there, deep, raw, permanent, unless scrubbed by someone trained to erase hate with paint. But he didn't look at it again. He already knew what it said, and he already knew who had written it. There were no heroes in that store, no villains made of comic book ink, just people. Some who watched, some who acted, some who waited too long to do either. He reached for the driver's side door, but something caught his eye. A folded slip of paper, tucked beneath the wiper blade. At first he thought it might be another note. More bile, more cowardice masked as courage. But as he opened it, the handwriting told a different story. The ink shook, uneven in pressure. The curves of the letters pushed down like the writer didn't know if they should finish the sentence they'd started. He unfolded the note carefully.
No name. No return address.
Just a confession. I watched what happened in there. I didn't stop it. I didn't say anything. My husband was one of them. He was raised that way. But that's no excuse. I saw how you looked at him, not with hate, but like you'd seen men like him before. I married a man who taught our son to cross the street when he saw a black man walking toward him. Today was the first time our son asked why. I didn't have an answer. But he saw you. He saw what you did. And now he knows different. I don't know if that fixes anything, but I needed you to know that it changed something. Thank you. Shaq stood there for a long moment, the letter resting between his fingers like something too fragile to fold again. He read it twice, then a third time. The twist wasn't the words, it was where they came from. The woman had been part of it. Even if silent, even if only in marriage, in history, in proximity to the man who started the storm. And yet, something had moved her. Something had cracked the script, and through that crack, truth had leaked out. Quietly, anonymously. But it had leaked. He folded the note carefully, and placed it in the glove box. Not to keep, but to remember. Because it wasn't validation. It wasn't redemption. But it was real. The applause had stopped now. Most people had drifted away. Back to their routines. Back to forgetting. But Shaq hadn't moved yet. He stood beside the car, hand resting on the roof, eyes distant. He thought about the boy's question, why no one had helped. He thought about Janelle's story, about the girl in the park, about the mother working 2 jobs. He thought about Dennis, about what resentment turns into when it doesn't get named. And he thought about his own mother, about Lucille, about the way she used to say, "Don't measure a man by the people who clap for him, measure him by the people who feel safe when he stands beside them." Applause was a reflex, but protection was a decision. And justice? Justice didn't come with noise. It came with weight, with presence, with showing up when no one else would. Before getting in the car, Shaq glanced back toward the store entrance one last time. A few late shoppers trickled in, unaware of the fault lines that had just cracked across the tiles inside. A mother walked in with her teenage daughter. A man carried a bouquet of plastic-wrapped flowers. Business as usual. But the story had changed. And even if most would pretend it hadn't happened, even if the footage never showed it, even if no one remembered the name of the boy who asked the hardest question in the room, Shaq would. He climbed into the driver's seat, engine humming to life with a low, steady growl. The car pulled smoothly out of the space, leaving behind the slurs still scratched into its side, but not taking them with him. They weren't his to carry. As the vehicle turned onto the main road, the wind caught up again. A soft gust, brushing leaves across the blacktop like applause never could. It didn't cheer, it cleared. And that made all the difference. The letter sat on the passenger seat, folded twice, just enough wear at the corners to show it had been opened, and read more than once already. But this one wasn't like the first. This wasn't from someone watching safely from a distance, trying to reconcile their silence. This letter was from the center of the storm. When Shaq had returned home, after the noise had faded and the sky had begun to darken, he'd reached into his jacket and found it tucked beneath his windshield wiper. Another slip of paper, handwritten. But this one had a different kind of tremble to the ink. Less guilt, more reckoning. He'd read it once, and then again, and again. Now parked just outside his mother's house, engine off, street lamp humming above, he unfolded it once more. The letter was short, but it didn't need to be long to land hard. Shaquille. My name doesn't matter. You already know me by association. I'm Dennis's wife. I was in the store. I saw everything. I saw the way my husband spoke, the way he stared. I've seen it before, not just toward strangers, toward me, our son, the world. I used to think it was just pride or frustration, but today I saw it for what it was, fear, the kind of fear that turns into hate when no one teaches it better. You did something I couldn't. You held a mirror to him without raising your voice. You didn't punish him. You showed him. You showed all of us. Our son asked me a question today. He asked if that big man was a superhero. I said no. I said you were just a man who stood up when others didn't. And he said that's what heroes do. So thank you. Not just for Janelle, for my son, for me. Whatever happens with Dennis, you changed something in this house. And I pray that change keeps going. Shaq let the letter rest in his hands for a few quiet moments, before setting it gently on the dashboard. It wasn't the first time he'd received something like it. But rarely had it come from inside the circle of the problem, from someone who lived in the same house as the hurt. He sat there for a while, staring out the windshield. The porch light at his mother's place glowed steady. A motion sensor flickered softly as a cat moved across the front steps. He didn't need to knock. He never did. But tonight he didn't go inside. Not yet. Instead, he reached for his phone. It rang only once before Lucille answered. I was wondering when you'd call, she said, voice warm with that unshakable calm she always carried. Shaq leaned back in the seat, eyes still on the porch. Just finished reading something, he said. You sound like something sat heavy on your chest. It did. She didn't press. Lucille had always known when to stay quiet. He breathed deep. A woman. Dennis's wife. She wrote to me. Lucille didn't speak, but he could feel her listening. She saw it all. What he said, what he did. And instead of pretending it didn't matter, she owned it. Told me her son called me a superhero. There was a pause. Then Lucille chuckled, soft and full. Well, that's a first. Never thought I'd raise a cape-wearing grocery store crusader. Shaq smiled. Just barely. She said something else. That Dennis wasn't always like that. That somewhere along the way the fear turned into something uglier. Something taught. Lucille's voice came slower now. Hate always starts as fear. Fear of losing something. Fear of being left behind. Fear of being wrong. I used to think men like him were just angry. Shaq said. But it's deeper, isn't it? They're scared, baby. Scared that the world's shifting and they can't hold on to the old rules anymore. And fear, when left alone too long, grows teeth. Shaq rubbed his forehead. The letter was still sitting on the dash, illuminated now by the glow of the porch light and the dashboard clock. I didn't even raise my voice, he said. You didn't need to, Lucille replied. Sometimes the truth speaks loudest when your mouth stays shut. Another silence. I keep thinking about that boy, he added, the one who asked why no one helped his mom. He wasn't accusing anyone. He was just confused. That's the worst part, Lucille said. Children are born clean. No hate. No shame. Just questions. But if the people around them don't answer right, they grow up thinking the silence was the answer. Shaq leaned forward now, resting his elbows on the steering wheel, phone still pressed to his ear. I just keep asking myself if it's enough. The standing up, the quiet resistance. If it really changes anything. Lucille was quiet for a long beat. Then, it changes you. And if it changes you, it changes the world you touch. That's how real change happens. Not with noise, but with consistency. He nodded slowly. You don't need to change everyone, she said. You just need to hold your ground when it counts, because someone's always watching. And sometimes someone writes a letter. A breeze rustled through the trees outside. A dog barked in the distance. The hum of the street lamp above shifted pitch for a second, like it was tuning into the moment. Come inside, Lucille said softly. I made cornbread. Shaq laughed once. Still sweet? Always. He hung up the call and sat there for another moment, watching the world move slowly outside his window. The letter still sat on the dash, fluttering slightly with the air from the vent. Then he took it gently, folded it with care, and slid it into the glove box next to the first. Not as proof, but as memory, because some stories change the people who hear them, and some confessions change the people who make them. But every so often, a story changes them both, quietly, permanently. And that letter, like the day, was never going to leave him. Shaq, he shouted, eyes wide as if the idea of this giant man standing in his apartment had just shattered every boundary between reality and dreams. You came to my birthday. Shaq crouched slightly, holding out the bag, heard there was cake to be made. Carter reached for the bag eagerly, fingers brushing the paper before turning to his mom for silent permission. Janelle nodded, and he opened it with both hands. Inside sat a miniature basketball jersey, kid-sized, black and gold, with "Be kind" stitched in bold lettering above a small embroidered number 3. Shaq smiled. That's yours, for being the kindest kid I met this year. Carter clutched it to his chest, eyes wide with something beyond excitement. Pride, maybe. Or the kind of joy that only comes when the world finally tells you you matter. Janelle stepped back, motioning Shaq in. He ducked slightly through the frame, careful not to bump his head. The apartment was quiet, but alive. The kind of quiet where things have finally settled, not because nothing was wrong but because peace had finally been earned. In the kitchen, a simple cake pan sat on the counter, batter already poured. A second box of mix rested beside it, unopened. We were just about to put it in the oven, Janelle said, wiping her hands on a towel. Wanted to make sure he got to do it himself. Carter had already dragged a chair to the counter and was pointing excitedly at the oven knob. I remember. 3. Shaq watched, arms crossed loosely, as Janelle leaned down to help him adjust the temperature. There was no rush, no background noise of chaos or tension, just this, a mother and son making a cake on a birthday that nearly passed without candles. Shaq didn't sit. He stayed standing near the window, watching as the sun pushed through the slatted blinds, in soft glowing lines. He could see the street from here. A few kids kicked a ball against the curb. A man pushed a stroller with one hand, talking on the phone with the other. The world continued. But something about this small room, with its cracked tile and overloved furniture, held more truth than anything happening outside. Janelle turned toward him, brushing her braid behind one ear. You didn't have to do this. Shaq shrugged. Didn't seem like anyone else was going to. She nodded slowly, not as agreement, but as understanding. You know, I was scared for a long time that Carter would grow up thinking the world didn't care about people like us, that he'd look around and only see silence when something went wrong. But today he saw someone show up, not just for him, for a stranger, and he won't forget that. He shouldn't have to see it in the first place, Shaq said quietly. No, she agreed, but now that he has, at least he saw what it looks like to push back, with grace, with strength. Carter's voice called out from the kitchen. Mom, timer's on. Janelle smiled, walked over, and pressed a kiss to his forehead. Perfect job, baby. Shaq glanced at his watch. I should let y'all enjoy it. Didn't mean to intrude. You didn't, she said, stepping back beside him. You reminded me the world still got people in it worth believing in. Shaq reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small folded card. This is for you. Nothing fancy. Just a contact at a foundation I work with. They help with housing, child care, job training, quiet work, but solid. Janelle took it gently, eyes flicking down to the name and number. Her breath caught just a little, the way it does when something shifts inside you, when something you didn't dare hope for shows up anyway. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Don't say anything yet, Shaq replied. Just call when you're ready. She nodded. He turned to Carter, now standing proudly in front of the oven, jersey draped over his shoulder like a trophy. You save me a slice? Shaq asked. 2, Carter grinned. Shaq gave a small salute and headed for the door. He paused once on the threshold, glanced back one last time. Happy birthday, little man. Carter waved both hands. Best one ever. Shaq stepped into the hallway and gently closed the door behind him. The hallway was quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full, with something new, something warm. A moment that mattered. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, and the sky was beginning to change. Hints of gold, soft streaks of orange edging into blue. The kind of light that doesn't announce itself, but lingers. Shaq walked back toward his car, his steps easy, his shoulders relaxed. The streets were still the same, but something in him wasn't. He thought of Carter, of the cake rising slowly in the oven, of the boy's hands pressed against that little jersey like it was stitched from magic. As he slid into the driver's seat, the radio came to life automatically. Soft jazz, a horn moaning lazily beneath a bass line. He didn't change the station. He just drove. And as the city passed by, building by building, tree by tree, Shaq's voice rose in narration. Not in speech, not in sermon, but in quiet reflection. The world don't change in explosions. It changes in inches. In the way one kid sees kindness and decides to pass it on. In the way a stranger shows up. Not to save, but to stand beside. Most people think the big moments matter more. But sometimes it's just about showing up for the small ones. The ones no one claps for. The ones that happen without cameras. The ones that shape a boy's heart before the world tries to harden it. The image shifts inside Janelle's apartment. Carter stands in the kitchen, watching the oven timer count down. Janelle kneels beside him, whispering something, and he laughs. A flicker of candlelight dances on the kitchen counter. As the lights dim, the oven dings. Janelle pulls out the cake, placing it gently on the counter. She sticks a single candle in the center, lights it, then lifts her son so he can see it clearly. He takes a breath. The glow hits his eyes, round and full of wonder. And then, he blows it out. Cut to black. The soft flicker of candlelight fades, replaced by sunlight spilling across the sidewalk outside. And the world, though not fixed, feels a little more human. A little more possible. Because someone showed up. And tomorrow's cake, it rose. If this story stirred something in you, don't walk away from it. Carry it into your everyday. Look closer, speak sooner, stand taller when someone else is being pushed down. Because the quietest moments reveal who we really are. And sometimes, all it takes to change someone's world is choosing not to look away.